Vagyu Ji Ka Khalsa, Vagyu Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. Today's class is a part of the live series Love and Justice through Guru Nanak Sahib. This class will begin with a 40-minute lecture, followed by 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So please drop your questions in the chat box and be sure to include your name and city. Now, I would like to introduce you to our instructor, who I'm sure you are all very familiar with by now. Asha Marie Kaur is a research assistant with Sikhi. She has a BA in political science and international studies from Northwestern University. Her work at Sikhi is tied to her love of the Persian language and the way it connects Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Please welcome Asha.
Hi, Guru Granth Sahib. Hi, Guru Fateh. Welcome to the second to last session of Love and Justice through Guru Nanak Sahib. So a little bit sad, but I'm still excited for this session, and thank you all for being here. All right, so this week's topic is prayer. This actually is going to encompass kind of two strains of thought that I thought would be really important to cover in this course. So we'll get into those kind of two separate areas. It is a little bit of a deviation from the other engaging with Shabad sessions we've had, because it's not really necessarily about a societal injustice as much as it's about societal practice, but also this session harkens back to a lot of our original questions about the framing of teaching about Sikhi. So I think it's a really great way to tie up this portion of the course where we've been engaging with Shabad, and then next week we'll finish off with a session about taking everything we've discussed and putting it toward an ongoing framework of how to apply Guru Nanak Sahib's teachings to the contemporary world, how to formulate a Sikh stance on an issue, and I'll kind of give people an idea of where to go next if you enjoyed what you've learned here. So next week I will try to make it more half and half lecture, half discussion. And I am going to request that at some point people send in a couple of written components, which I'll discuss at the end of today's session. All right, so since we're harkening back to some of the original questions of this course, let's discuss what have we covered so far. So we know that the Guru Granth Sahib reveals engagement with a variety of faiths, traditions, beliefs, and principles common to the population of the area and the era. There is this common and incorrect notion that it's trying to blend practices, particularly Hindu practices and Muslim practices. We've discussed why that's kind of a false way of looking at things, and rather these are just simply engagements, and it's not limited, in fact, to Hindu practice or Muslim practice. It's just those happen to be predominant belief systems of the area and era. There's also references to Buddhist, Jain, and indigenous lifestyles. And we've covered some very specific examples of what this engagement looks like. We talked about Guru Nanak Sahib's dialogue in Mecca. We talked about his rejection of the Janeu ceremony. We've discussed the invocation of Azrael, the Abrahamic angel of death. And we've gone over Guru Nanak Sahib's dialogue in Baghdad, where he actually recited the call to prayer to an audience that was confused about who he was and what he stood for, while also adding an additional revelation from the Sikh school of thought to the call of prayer. So affirming, but also leading the path towards something new, something that stands on its own. So this is engagement. And we know that Ik Onkar is the nucleus of the Sikh paradigm. If a thought cannot fit in the framework of oneness, it frankly does not inform Sikh practice. So this means that some practices stem from frameworks that are just absolute fallacies. They simply cannot fit in the Ik Onkar paradigm. And some of these things are more obvious than others. Like we've discussed, casteism, fundamentally incompatible with the Ik Onkar paradigm, sexism, and many of society's other isms, like racism, And also the notion that a non-believer is lesser or has some inherent path to condemnation, that also doesn't fit in the Ik Onkar paradigm, which is an engagement that we see in the way the Sikh gurus speak of that false division that gets created. Oftentimes in the Abrahamic faiths, there's very explicit divisions created between the believer and the non-believer. So yes, people who don't know what they believe, people who do not actively believe, atheists, they still exist in the Ik Onkar paradigm. You cannot separate anyone from the Ik Onkar paradigm regardless of what their belief is. So now moving into what we're going to be discussing today, Guru Nanak Sahib regularly reveals wisdom that seeks to dismantle rituality. Sometimes that is the ritual itself. For example, in the case of the Janeo ceremony. This is also the case in a very horrific religious practice called sati, which was common in Guru Nanak Sahib's era, where Hindu women were forced to jump into the cremation fire of their husbands if their husbands were to die. So that is another practice, outright condemned. It's, it's a horrific crime against women. And then sometimes it's about the ritual being done with no true intent behind it. So there's a very common Sakhi or narrative about Guru Nanak Sahib shortly after his revelation of there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim, attending the Friday prayers led by the local Qazi, and he didn't participate in the prayers, and the Qazi called him out and said, listen, if you're saying you're not a Hindu, you're not a Muslim, whatever, you don't really have you're saying in either of these things, why not just participate in the prayer? And Guru Nanak Sahib said, I would, but there's no one truly leading the prayer, because the Qazi was simply repeating words mindlessly while his thoughts lay elsewhere. And this is a sort of common theme in Gurbani, where Guru Nanak Sahib and other gurus and the Bhagats discuss, you keep doing this, you keep saying this prayer, you keep fasting, you keep cleansing yourself in a ritual bath, etc., but your thoughts, your practices have no pure intent, they have malicious intent. So what does it mean to have malicious intent in your mind, but to be trying to purify yourself through fasting or a ritual bath? So there's different types of engagement. Sometimes the ritual itself is what's being dismantled, and sometimes the orientation one has while practicing a type of practice is what's being dismantled. But overall, the goal is to craft eternal principles. This is one of the qualities of Ik Onkar that is stated in Mool Mantar. So is that eternality. And so one of the calls to action from Mool Mantar is to craft eternal principles. When are the principles you're enacting, do they have true intent? Do they benefit others and yourself and others in the notion of oneness? Is this creating something that exists beyond self and beyond the confines of our fleeting nature in this world? So that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for eternal principles and ones that have real intent and real impact as well. So I'm going to go over another example of the way Guru Nanak Sahib engages with a group of people partaking in a ritual, and then we'll go into the Shabad that was assigned in the handouts for this session. Again, we're going to talk about two different things here. First, what does it mean for the Sikh faith for its charter, the Guru Granth Sahib, to make reference repeatedly to the practices of other faiths? Are we supposed to perceive these as endorsements? Are we supposed to perceive these as rejections? Not quite. These are engagements. But what does it mean to engage with these things, and how is that teaching us something? And how is that teaching both the universal world something, as well as those who choose the Sikh faith? Because again, the Guru Granth Sahib is accessible to all. So there is something to be learned across populations and backgrounds. But there's also something to be said about the new standing on its own Sikh faith. So how do we react to this if we're from outside of the Sikh faith? And how do we react to this when this is going to inform how we practice as Sikhs? Because again, these messages can be accessed by people from both backgrounds. So we're going to discuss that. And then we're also going to discuss, okay, if we're talking about dismantling rituality, what are we aiming for? And this, again, harkens back to something I brought up in the very beginning of the course, which is that oftentimes when non-Sikhs are taught, yes, you see in Sikhi, we don't really have ritual, they're often quickly trying to poke holes, being like, well, wait a minute. Well, I went to your Gurdwara and I saw people do XYZ thing, and that looks like a ritual to me. So that's okay, you have that observation. So now we're going to discuss, what does it mean for something to be a Sikh practice, and what about these Sikh practices makes them stand apart from the notion of rituality? And so what are we aiming for? Like, how do we make sure Sikh practice is rooted in eternal principles rather than fleeting rituality? All right, so this painting is called Cosmic Arti, and it depicts, it is the artist's interpretation of Guru Nanak Sahib's reaction to an Arti ceremony, which will be explained in a bit for people who don't have that background. And it is a reflection on the beauty of nature that Guru Nanak Sahib called upon in his reaction to an Arti ceremony conducted by Hindu pundits. So, taking the visual, it's nice to have these visuals to get us some headspace before we discuss the narrative. Okay, so at the top we have some Shabad that talks about taking the ceremony of Arti and moving it toward the adoration of creation, the adoration of nature. In the platter of the sky, the sun and moon are the lamps. The stars and the constellations are the pearls. Fragrance of sandalwood is the incense, the air fans. The entire vegetation is the flowers, O luminous one. This is from page 663 of the Guru Granth Sahib. Nature is the Guru's Arti, adoration prayer. So this Shabad was revealed when Guru Nanak Sahib headed to Puri, which is in what is today Odisha or Orissa, India. So Puri is known for having this massive festival at the Jagannath temple, and Guru Nanak Sahib and Bhai Mardana showed up when that festival was happening. You know, it's a huge crowd. Unfortunately, it still was conducted this year despite COVID-19, and I think it was something like 400,000 people showed up. So the area is buzzing with worshipers that are eager to see this massive wheeled idol of Krishna, and people would even throw themselves under the wheeled kind of deity on a float for the honor of being crushed by it. So at this, you know, as the festival was winding down, the local pundit, Krishna Lal, invited the Guru and Bhai Mardana to Arti, which is an evening prayer in Hindu practice conducted by pundits that's meant to, again, it's a form of ritual practice in Hinduism, and it's conducted in the evening. So, but it's directed towards idols and statues and other elements that go into this sort of practice. So there's oil lamps that are lit, and incense, and bells and conches to make sound, and lights twinkling and swaying, and there's particular chants that are done, et cetera, et cetera. So again, similar to the story I told earlier with the Ghazi, Guru Nanak Sahib just kind of passively was there, passively existed there, did not actively participate in the various ritual elements of this prayer. So after the ceremony, the pundits, they're really upset. They said, why didn't you participate? And Guru Nanak Sahib explained that no ceremony was necessary. Nature's bright flowers and the twinkling stars were where his attention were. That's where his attention was the entire time. And there was no need to go through all the material elements of creating this ritual when already there are beautiful elements that are accessible to all people. Now, this accessibility bit is extremely important. Who conducts the Arti ceremony? Pundits that are Brahmins. So it is a caste-based regulated ceremony. Secondly, we have many Shabads by the Bhagats who came from backgrounds that were oppressed by untouchability that discussed how they were turned away from mandirs, turned away from ceremonies because they were not permitted to be there. So not only is Guru Nanak Sahib dismantling a ritual practice, he's saying, this is something that's regulated by a specific group of people, whereas where I'm drawing my attention, there is something beautiful, something that I can reflect on, something that makes me grounded in Ekankar, grounded in oneness, that's accessible to all people. So the accessibility issue gets resolved in this new framing, in this new orientation. So the Guru began to sing to the tune of the Rabab, played by my Bana, and worshippers were drawn to the Shabad that was revealed, and their attention turned away from these pundits who are creating this exclusionary, kind of limited practice, and toward the vastness of the earth and the sky. So as we can see here, Guru Nanak Sahib takes issue with how Arti is conducted and questions its true efficacy or true, and questions its orientation, but does not say anything outright, he doesn't do anything outright rude or doesn't outright condemn. He simply reorients the practice and says, I have something here that is more eternal, more accessible, more in line with oneness. And that transformed the audience and changed their orientation as well. So let's think about the sort of framework that we're looking at here. Unfortunately, we have a culture of a little bit of picking and choosing. This is an issue everywhere. This is not just something to do with Sikhi. And so oftentimes when people are trying to make a point, they'll bring up mentions in the Guru Granth Sahib of a particular practice and say, oh, this is proof that this practice is a part of Sikhi. And that comes from the false notion that the idea is to blend practices into this new syncretic faith. Or people will say, Guru Nanak Sahib or the other gurus brought up this practice, so it must be a rejection, without necessarily looking and saying, wait, what was the engagement? It could be a rejection. Like I said, there are some things that are rejected that don't fit in the Ekankar paradigm, but you just looking at the mention doesn't always tell you that that's the case. There is a surrounding context. We have to dive into the Shabad. We have to look at what it's saying. And we have to you cannot find the answer unless you're actually engaging with the Shabad. It's not going to jump out and grab you. This is just an active process. And because of this active process, this means we're creating room for differing outcomes. So Guru Nanak Sahib is never going to say all things that this group of people do are bad and all things this group of people do are good. That's the very simplistic, divisive kind of binary way of looking at things. You know, there are specific elements that are contended with, and that means that some things will have room, perhaps, with a little bit of reorientation to fit in the Ikonkar paradigm, and then some things won't. But it's not about saying this group of people, this system, this framework, this intention, those things can be bad, but we never ever, the Ikonkar paradigm does not have room for the condemnation of people themselves, you know? We are all manifestations of Ikonkar. But sometimes our practice is in violation of the Ikonkar paradigm, particularly when it comes to caste, which we have talked about, and also, again, the creating a hierarchy between believer and non-believer, saying that a non-believer is somehow lesser or has some outright condemnation. And these engagements also create new beginnings that stand on their own. So let's say, you know, a practice is discussed. That doesn't mean that it's a Sikh practice, it's just one that's being discussed. And, you know, we talked in the very beginning of the course about how, for example, with terminology, there is terminology in the Guru Granth Sahib that comes from Hindu schools of thought, there's terminology that comes from Islamic schools of thought, and then there's a completely new lexicon that was created in the Guru period in the foundation of the Sikh faith. So again, we have opportunities for new beginnings, and this is not, the result is not that blended idea. So now we will get into the Shabad that I assigned for today. If you haven't already, I do recommend listening to my podcast on it. I think it's a good one. So I think it'll be very helpful to dive into these things. So we'll go through it line by line and figure out, okay, let's engage with the Shabad and see what the engagement is and see what we get out of it. Right. So first we begin with a shalok. And this is the course by Guru Nanak Sahib, as is all the assigned Shabads in this course. Vihif Naseet Siddak Masala Haq Halal Quran. Let compassion be the mosque, conviction the prayer space, pious truth the Quran. Sadam Sunat Sidu Roja Bahul Musulman. With restraints of circumcision, good conduct the fast, then one becomes a true Muslim. Okay, so already we're kind of seeing the approach here, right? Guru Nanak Sahib doesn't say, forsake the mosque, throw out the Quran, forget the prayer space. That's not what's being said here. Guru Nanak Sahib says, let compassion be the mosque, conviction the prayer space, pious truth the Quran. There are two possibilities here. You could be someone who is a Muslim, who continues to worship at the mosque, utilizing a prayer space, reading from the Quran, and you make sure that you do so with the embodiment of compassion, conviction, and pious truth. Or you could be a non-Muslim, you could be a Sikh, and you do not need the mosque, the prayer space, the Quran, as long as you have compassion, conviction, and pious truth. So again, there are two ways to engage with the Shabad depending on where you're coming from and what your chosen path is. And Guru Nanak Sahib doesn't say stop being a Muslim. In fact, he offers an approach to being a good Muslim should one choose to walk on that path. Karni Kaaba, Sach Pir, Kalma Karam Nivaj. Good deeds the Kaaba, which is in Mecca, the direction to which Muslims pray. Eternal truth, the spiritual guide. Graceful words, the prayer. Tasbi Satasu Bhavsi, Nanak Sakhelaj. Notions that the one likes are the rosary. Nanak says, by this rosary, one's honor is truly protected. So true protection is not found in material objects. You can have the material objects, but if you're not living in the qualities of Ikonkar, the qualities in Mul Mantar, it's just a meaningless object. This is also an interesting line. Akparaya Nanaka Osasur Osasai. Nanak says, appropriating another's legitimate rights is like pork for Muslims and beef for Hindus. Guru Nanak Sahib knows that people have deeply held beliefs and practices depending on their religious context. So he is just like he knows people have a deep relationship to the imagery, say, of Azrael, the angel of death in Abrahamic faith. And just like he invoked Azrael when talking about death, he invokes this deep-seated avoidance that is found in these two religious practices and says, okay, this is something you avoid at all costs. Take that feeling you have when you are avoiding these things at all costs and do the same when it comes to avoiding the appropriation of another person's legitimate rights. Take that same approach to staying away from and not even touching oppressive practice. Now, Guru Nanak Sahib does not believe in these sorts of divisive, specific dietary restrictions. But I think if this helps you get in that sort of mindset of how to approach this living by eternal principles, you can think of it this way. So yes, the Guru or Peer provides support only if one doesn't eat these carcasses. So just like in these practices, you feel that you will only be supported if you avoid beef or pork, you should also think that way about avoiding oppressive actions. So, Guru Pir Hamata Barejam Wardar Nachai. Okay. Gali Bisti Najai Chote Sach Kamai. There is no going to heaven by talking. Freedom is earned only through the eternal truth. You can say all your prayers correctly, word for word, every single day. But if you're not practicing eternal principles, if you're not living truthfully, if you're not embodying the principles you claim to be invoking by reciting these prayers, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not freeing yourself from anything. You're just digging yourself into a deeper and deeper pit of lies that you're telling yourself that are fed by the ego. So, Maram pai haram mai hoy halal na jai. There's no spinning the haram into the halal. You know when you're acting in an unjust way. You know it. It is only the ego that helps you conceal and shove down that feeling. But you know it. You have the ability to orient yourself in the way of oneness. You have the ability to have the just actions, the halal actions. And you can't spin those haram actions into halal ones. And again, he's using terminology that is applicable to the lives of the people listening and is known and is a framework that is common to the place, the culture, and the time period. So, Nanak says, only trash is received by trash talks. Fairly simple principle here. If you say things that are lies, you're not going to get true satisfaction out of them. If you slander people, it will come back to bite you. Fairly simple principle here. So here, he says, Panj Navaja Vakt, Panji Panja Panja Now. 5 prayers, 5 times, 5 with 5 names. This refers to the 5 daily prayers in Islam. Then he takes this framework of 5, again, a known framework among Muslim audiences of the time, and says, You also have 5 pillars in Islam as well. So, let's look at what are the 5 pillars Guru Nanak Sahib proposes. Pehla sach, halal doi, tija khair khudai. First, truth. Second, ethics. Third, Khuda's grace. So the Creator's grace. Choti niti rasi man, panchvi sifat sanai. Fourth, sincere intention in mind. Fifth, glory and praise of the divine. Karni kalama aakhe ke ta Musliman stai. If your deeds match the prayers read, then you can be called a Muslim. So again, Guru Nanak Sahib is saying, if you want to be on the path of being a Muslim, then you need to very carefully ensure that your deeds, your thoughts, your actions, and your proposed lifestyle as per the prayers you're reading actually align, and that there's not deceit and deception and the concealment of unjust actions lying in there. And he warns us, Nanak jeti kuriyar kure kuri pai. Nanak says, many are trashy, they're pretenders, and they receive trash and trash. I personally love it in Shabad when you realize the sort of, I would say, fierce love, but also humor that's kind of invoked when Guru Nanak Sahib speaks. I mean, this may not be humorous to everyone, but to me, it's, he's a very honest person, He's saying, not everyone's going to get this. Not everyone's actually going to live it. It's not easy. The path to eternal principles is not easy. It takes a lot of vulnerability. It takes a lot of chiseling. It takes a lot of work day in and day out. It takes the ability to be honest with oneself. It takes humility. You have to forsake the ego, and the ego is the thing that's easiest to let us, it's so easy to let it guide us. It's so easy to fall into that trap. So this is difficult. So again, Guru Nanak Sahib is saying, if you follow the Sikh path, there are ways to engage with this. We see what we need to embody if we're following the Sikh path. We see that we need to embody compassion, conviction, pious truth, restraint, good conduct, good deeds, look for eternal truth, speak with graceful words, think about the qualities of Ik Onkar, as stated in Mool Mantar. We need to avoid appropriating another's legitimate rights. We need to be true to our word. We can't just put false words out there. We need to remember that we can't talk our way out of the unjustness of our actions should they be unjust. We should avoid trash talking. We should center truth, ethics, grace, sincere intention, the glory and praise of the divine. And we should make sure that our deeds match any prayer that we read. So that's how one engages with this as a Sikh. Let's start from the beginning again. Guru Nanak Sahib accepts and acknowledges that Muslims exist, and Muslims will continue to exist. Not everyone is obligated to take the Sikh path. And, Sikhi is about engaging with what is real. It's about reality. You cannot create a hypothetical world for yourself. You have to engage with this world. And again, we talk about Guru Nanak Sahib warning people of not engaging with the hypothetical world, engaging with the real world. When we see his engagements with the aesthetics of the time who would go off to do yoga on a mountaintop to achieve enlightenment, he says, no. You can't just go off. You need to engage with the real world. There's problems here in the real world that need to be contended with. There's a reality that needs to be faced. So it's the same with, people come from all walks of life. They have different paths and contexts they come in with, and they will continue to. That is all of creation is diverse. So should you stay on the Muslim path, here's what you can get out of this. Don't just go to the mosque in your prayer space and read the Quran. Remember to do so with that compassion, that conviction, and that pious truth. Don't say that you have restraint simply because you're circumcised. Actively practice that restraint. Don't just fast and chalk that up as your good conduct for the year. You actually have to make sure your conduct is good and not just that you're meeting your fast adequately. It doesn't matter what direction you pray in every day if your deeds aren't good. And if your spiritual guide that you're looking to is not guiding you on the path of truth, maybe it's time to look elsewhere. Make sure that your prayers are said with grace. A rosary is just a meaningless object if one isn't situating themselves in the qualities of oneness. Just as you are deathly afraid of accidentally eating pork or eating beef in the case of Hindus, you should avoid at all costs the oppressive behavior of appropriating another's legitimate rights. Because you will only find support in the wisdom of oneness if you are avoiding that appropriation. You can't talk your way out of things. So it doesn't matter if you're saying all your prayers correctly all the time, doing your 5 prayers, following the 5 pillars. It is possible to do all of those things and not be doing so in a way that is divine whatsoever. As you go about your 5 prayers, think about these 5 principles as well. And lastly, remember that this is not the easy path, and there will be a lot of people who aren't going to cut it on that path. All right, so we've talked about the specific Shabad and how to engage with it from both a Sikh lifestyle perspective and a Muslim lifestyle if one is engaging with the Guru Granth Sahib from that background. So what are we aiming for, right? So what is the Guru Granth Sahib is the foundational charter of the Sikhs. So what does the Sikh path look like? What does a Sikh lifestyle look like? What about the way we practice makes it non-ritualistic in nature? So we'll discuss that here. This is a painting by Arpana Kaur, which is really beautiful, which depicts the reading of the Guru Granth Sahib and the Mata taking before the Guru Granth Sahib, which is our only sovereign, the only body that we bow down to. So, not most of today's Sikh practice was not formulated or formalized in Guru Nanak Sahib's time, and this course is about Guru Nanak Sahib, but we will talk about the things that were. Remember, all of Sikh faith, Sikh practice, Sikh lifestyle was shaped throughout the Guru period, and then Guru Gobind Singh institutionalized the Khalsa Panth, the sovereign body of the Sikh, and that's where a lot of what are broadly known to the broader world as Sikh practice, that's when those come about. But we will talk about the beginnings of this in Guru Nanak Sahib's time. So what's a very important aspect of Guru Nanak Sahib's life was that he actively took his learnings and built institutions out of them in the form of the city of Kartarpur. Kartarpur is in what is now Pakistan, and it was the city Guru Nanak Sahib built that was an opt-in society where people chose a specific path as they moved to Kartarpur, and they made a commitment to practicing their life in a particular way. So Bhai Gurdas describes Kartarpur in his Vars, and here he says, the divine word of Sodar and Arti were sung in the evening. So the Bani that we discussed, that is a reflection on Arti, becomes the Bani that is recited in the evening. So we're seeing the beginning of the Shabad, the Bani that is a part of the Sikh name or lifestyle. This is the beginnings of it in Guru Nanak Sahib's time. The divine word of Japji Sahib, was recited at the immortal time in the early morning. Guru-oriented, Guru Nanak Sahib freed the people from the Atharvan Veda, from ritual text. People started believing in infinite wisdom. So when one moved to Kartarpur, you were united in your commitment to living in the flow of divine command, living in qualities of oneness. So in most societies, the ruler wields power to regulate individuals and create order. But in Kartarpur, that orientation was flipped. Regulation came from within through active reflection. So the Guru had forged a city of collective action, but without the strict laws common among rulers of kingdoms, which depend on a notion of fear, of punishment, of coercion. Instead, the framework was the nitname or the lifestyle. Each citizen of Kartarpur recited the Japji, morning prayers, and Sodar and Arti, evening prayers. And by reflecting on the Guru's words, each person began and ended their day in remembrance of the divine. So this opened up the mind for introspection and reflection, and by transforming the self, they prepared themselves to transform society through principled action. So today, Sikhs continue to live by the principle of oneness. Recitation of Japji, Sodar, and Arti are the basis for self-transformation. So we know that Sikh thought, the nucleus of Sikh thought is Ik Onkar. What is the nucleus of Sikh practice? That is Nam. Nam is the principle by which all Sikh practice can be oriented. So Baigar Das, again, discussing Kartarpur, says truth, contentment, compassion, principle, and money are all capable of control. Here, the Guru-oriented practice the teachings of the Guru and observe meditation on Nam, sharing and purifying the mind. People speak sweet here, walk humbly, give away charities, and remain devoted to the Guru's wisdom. So the principle of Nam was the essence of Kartarpur. Now to explain Nam, Nam indeed comes from the Indo-European word for name, but it's oftentimes just translated as name in mainstream translations of the Guru Granth Sahib, but that does not encapsulate the complexity of Nam or the way it is practiced. So think about it this way. The way a name becomes a signifier and a way of orienting ourselves, Nam becomes the signifier and frame of orientation for one's actions as a Sikh. So we use names to call our attention in certain directions and to engage in a certain way. Just like that, Nam encompasses any mode of engagement that reminds one, that brings up the relationship with Ik Onkar. So just like when I hear someone's name, I think about all my memories with them, I think about what they mean to me, I think about my relationship to them. It's the same thing with Nam is any action that does that with regards to our relationship with Ik Onkar. So when we're living in actions informed by Nam, that means that we have a strong commitment to one another, not toward rulers and people that we're scared of or coerced into bowing down to. We have a commitment to one another in this more lateral way. And only Ik Onkar has that all-encompassing power that we bow to. And if we orient ourselves in Nam, this means that our service to each other, the provision of goods, all of these things they flow. They're able to occur in harmony. And when social division is abolished, a society can bloom in full potential, because injustice thrives on division, on thoughts and words that declare some people better than others. So thoughts and words that declare some people better than others, that leads us astray from Nam. When we are oriented toward oneness, we're not having those sorts of thoughts or speaking those sorts of words. We don't declare some people more deserving of greater status and riches. So Guru Nanak Sahib illuminated a new path through the cultivation of remembrance, not ego, and the people of Kartarpur were able to recognize the oneness that bound one another, and everyone shared equally in the resources they created. So there was no shortage in Kartarpur. People did not suffer from shortage. All right, so I now have to describe what we're doing in our last session, which is very sad. It's a little sad face here. So we have finished our broader section of the course where we've engaged with Shabad, and we're going to finish off the course with a discussion of Guru Nanak Sahib's teachings in the contemporary world. So we'll talk about what makes Guru Nanak Sahib's approach to confronting justice unique. How do we teach principles of justice without a sense of superiority or ego? This is super important because Guru Nanak Sahib, revealed his principles this way, and how do we do that as well? How do we carve out a path, and how do we live in this path without saying, "Oh, I've got it all figured out"? Because none of us have it all figured out. It's a process. And how do we govern without explicit rejections or endorsements of various ways of life? A lot of the injustice in this world comes from a deep-seated fear of difference and a desire to control. And that is not the framework of Ikonkar. So how do we govern without that need for control that becomes quite violent oftentimes? So there will be a longer time for discussion. And if anyone has requests for Bonnie that engage with specific topics, just ask. I'll try to jot down all the requests. And then so next week, if you have a request, if you could just write your email alongside your request, I will jot it down and I will try to help people connect with Shabad from the Guru Granth Sahib that is based on the topic they want to explore further. I will also be asking, this will be after the next session, but I want to get people thinking about it. I will ask if perhaps folks could write an example of how they think Sikh thought relates to a certain issue. So we're going to walk through the framework of articulating the Sikh stance on something, and then you get to practice it. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's literally just your way of applying what you've learned to something that you choose that's meaningful to you. And I would also love to get everyone's written reflections on the course as a whole. What did you like? What do you want to know more about? Just any and all feedback will be welcome. So with that, I would like to thank you all, and we have some time for questions.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Asha. Yes, I would welcome everyone to ask any questions that they might have after today's session into our Q&A box. We do have a couple minutes for those. I'm happy to start off the Q&A portion with some thoughts of my own or question. It's not fully formed, so this is, kind of an unfinished thought. But when you were talking about Kartarpur, I think two things came up for me. I think it really, I'd love to know what your take on policing would be based on kind of what we were discussing in or what you were saying in regards to Kartarpur, because that's something that came up for me. Community safety, collective safety, crime as a concept. I would love to know, any reflections that you have on that, and perhaps also touching on the idea this kind of feels like a golden period of Sikhi, for lack of a better term. So kind of those are my two reflections, and I'd love to know your thoughts in regards to both of those.
Yeah, of course. So I personally see such a wealth of connections between Sikhi and an abolitionist framework. For those who don't know, kind of the end goal being to abolish prisons as we know them today and to abolish police forces as we know them today. I can say with confidence that Kartarpur didn't have those things. And I think that we start from the notion of no shortage, right? So when a society has no shortage and all people are cared for materially, we already start from a radically different world than the one we have today that depends on the coercive mechanism of prisons and policing. So we already begin in a very radically different space. And again, there is, in today's prison system, prison acts as a way of trying to separate people out from society and trying to say, well, you have qualities that make you inherently bad and wrong, and there's nothing we can do to transform that, so we're just going to make you sit cut off from everyone for a long period of time. And that is literally the system. I mean, we don't have a restorative model in today's prison. So that cutting off violates the Ikonkar principle. It will ultimately come back to hurt all the people involved. So it ends up creating harm for the person being cut out from society, ends up creating harm for the people that are regulating that, ends up creating harm for the person who is perhaps even harmed by the crime that this person partook in. So yeah, the notion of transformation is Guru Nanak Sahib's story. Guru Nanak Sahib went all over the subcontinent and the larger Asian continent and transformed people's lives and changed their orientation, the way they thought about things, including people that were considered lost causes by the powers that were. So I think that when we look at it that way, you know, Kartarpur becomes an excellent model for the future that was actually in the past. So, and the second thing about the golden period, yes, this may not be what you had in mind, but I'm just going to throw out a little mini thought, which is that it's there's been a lot of celebration that the Kartarpur corridor was opened, and so Sikhs can now go visa-free to visit Kartarpur from India to Pakistan. And though I applaud that, I think that Kartarpur has been kind of reduced a lot of times in the way it's spoken about to this very symbolic, to have this very symbolic quality, and it's not considered a place of fully fledged institutions, you know, and a place where society came together, you know. It's kind of become a place you look at and don't deeply engage with. And so when I think about what we lost from that golden era and what we should be aiming for, that's something that comes up a lot for me, is like not reducing places to just being destinations for migration, you know.
Thank you. You definitely did answer my, not really questions, but just my kind of just thoughts. Yes, thank you. We also have a question about your email address. Would you mind? I can throw that in the chat box as well, but if you want to state aloud what your email address is.
Yes, my email is asha.kaur@sikri.org.
Awesome. I will throw that into the chat box as well for those who would like to get in touch with Asha. And we also have another question from Kieran Deep from London. They ask, how do we avoid becoming caught in ritualistic practice as taught by Guruji? Sorry, just a bit open-ended, not well formulated. Thank you, Kieran Deep.
This is a super important question, and it's hard. I will be honest. I think something that I used to struggle with is I would oftentimes, you know, say Mool Mantar or do Nam Simran or Ardas even, because I was scared of something and I wanted to, you know, assure myself, like calm myself down. And it's one thing to use Sikh practice as a way of recentering, but it's another thing to have this kind of fear-based, okay, I'm really scared of something happening, so I'm going to do this thing, and then I'm going to ensure it doesn't happen, you know? And it takes a lot of like vulnerability and acceptance of hukam, acceptance of divine commands, to say, okay, I am going to do these things, but it's not going to be to try to prevent, because I can't prevent things. I can only ground myself, reorient myself, and center myself in a way that I'm able to successfully cope. You know, in Gurbani, it's said that the world is like, living in this world is like, this is, you know, a lot, but it's like it's being in this ocean of fire, and you're on a boat and you're trying not to fall off, you know? So how do I keep myself strong and steady, and thinking of it that way rather than I'm scared of something and I'm going to tell myself that if I engage in this practice, I'm going to prevent that thing. So I guess the kind of one-liner is, I think that a lot of ritual is born out of fear and is born out of trying to control things that are frankly beyond our control, that are only in Ikwankar's control and they're not in ours. So the more we try to move away from fear and control, I think the more that our practice becomes like eternal and honest in the way Guru Nanak Sahib discusses.
Thank you. So our last question is from Surinder. They ask, over the years, it seems that Sikhs have fallen back into their own rituals, which Guru Nanak wanted to get rid of.
Yeah,
that is the end of the
right.
question, but yes.
Yeah,
yeah,
that is true. There's a whole host of different reasons for this. Some of this is, you know, that again, some people aren't ready to move out of that fear-based control-based paradigm. Some of it is because of very particular cultural or political influences that sought to undermine Sikh practice, which made things more ritualistic than they were intended to be. So there's a whole host of reasons, but I do agree that this is an issue, and I think that it's on us as Sikhs to, you know, very honestly engage with that and contend with that, and be, you know, why, and question, like, why do we do these things? Does this fit in the Ikongar paradigm? Like, is this really the Sikh way? And I think that unfortunately we also have a culture of like discouraging questioning. But questioning is okay. It's good. It's correct. It's what the Gurus did. So let's always make room for questioning and discussing and figuring out, you know, what is the path we're trying to take.
Amazing. Thank you. That is all the time we have today, but I thank everyone for your participation and your questions. And I really look forward to our last session, unfortunately, next week. Please note, as always, that a recording of this live class will be available within 24 hours. And yeah, please tune in next week for the 12th week of this live course. Just to wrap up today's conversation, I would like to remind everyone that we are hosting, Sikhi is hosting bi-weekly live webinars. Our next one is on August 15th, the Sikhs in the Punjab, where Amandeep Sandhu, Harinder Singh, and Ranvish Singh will discuss the events from 73 years ago when two nation states were carved by the British map making, Hindustan and Pakistan. What's next to secure the Sikh aspirations and the Punjab's autonomy? You can register at sikri.org/webinars. And don't forget to tune into the Sikh Cast, a podcast produced by Sikhi, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you for joining in today. Our live class will be ending now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.